Sometimes federal procurements don't go according to the rules. Sometimes it's worse when bribes and kickbacks come into play. That's what the Justice Department's Procurement Collusion Strike Force tries to discover and prosecute. Now the strike force is expanding with 4 new members. We get the details from its director, Dan Glad. Mr. Glad, good to have you with us.
Hi, Tom. Great to be here.
And just briefly review the task, the strike force, what it does and what its scope is and where it fits in the hierarchy of oversight here in the government.
Sure. The Procurement Collusion Strike Force, which is a mouthful, so I'll call it the PCSF or the Strike Force, that is the Department of Justice's coordinated national and interagency response to antitrust crimes and other related fraud schemes that impact government procurement, grant and program funding at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. And we've been around since late 2019, and our mission is really two-pronged. One is to enhance deterrence, trying to stop these schemes before they happen. And we do that through education, outreach, and training to both federal agents who investigate these crimes and procurement officers at all levels who are in the position to spot them. And then when deterrence fails, and deterrence fails, men are no angels, we look to amplify the detection, investigation, and prosecution of these schemes. I think you asked, Tom, sort of like what we actually do. I'll tell you what I call our lane. And it's really, we use all the tools in the statutory toolbox, all the parts of the criminal code to go after any criminal conduct that distorts, perverts, subverts the competitive procurement process when the government is going out into the market to buy stuff.
And how do you find out about the fallen angels? Is it mostly whistleblowers?
Whistleblowers are certainly part of the mix. It's really a combination. We certainly will have whistleblowers who come in and who spot something. The Antitrust Division, which is the part of the Department of Justice I come from, has a long-standing policy, its leniency policy, which is essentially become a cooperator, tell us about the crimes that you did, and if you do fully cooperate, you'll get a benefit. The public, we rely on the public to send us tips and leads, and we have a public-facing website where members of the public can submit information. Our federal agents and investigators are well positioned to using either confidential sources or just the things they see to refer these matters to us. And then finally, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention the people who are really there, the procurement officers, the contracting officers, the people in government whose day-to-day job is buying stuff. They are able to spot the indicators, the red flags of these collusive schemes and report them. They often know something's wrong, even if they can't put a term on it. And so that's part of our outreach mission. And since we were founded, we've reached more than 31,000 government employees as part of this outreach. So that's 31,000 sets of eyes.
And since 2019, how busy has the strike force been? How many cases have you actually come together and gone after?
We've been busy. Since 2019, we've opened more than 100 criminal investigations. We have prosecuted to conviction, so either at trial or through a guilty plea, more than 50 individuals and companies. And of our public matter, so cases that are filed, this touches on more than $500 million of government spending. And I will say, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, that was my question. And by the way, we're speaking with Dan Glad. He is director of the Procurement Collusion Strike Force at the Justice Department and the Antitrust Division. I mean, the federal procurement system in the United States is in many ways the gold standard for the world. And most people that participate believe that it's fundamentally honest. It's not like India or Russia where bribery and corruption is the norm. Are we still in that place? And these are still exceptions? Because you say it occurs a lot, collusion and so forth.
They are exceptions. Federal government procurement is fundamentally sound. The majority of federal government procurement is not beset and attacked by bid rigging, price fixing, and fraud schemes. But I think about it in the way it's the law of large numbers. There's so much federal procurement that even a fractional loss is substantial. Tom, there's one study I'm aware of from an international NGO called the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, And what the OECD tried to do is assess how much money is lost from bid rigging, price fixing, and other collusive schemes at the outset from government spending. They looked at all governments around the world, and their assessment is that it's 20%, that there was a 20% collusion tax imposed by criminal conspiracies on government spending around the world. And the US is probably right there in the middle of that 20% number as a whole. I would say there are parts of the United States that may be higher. Tom, I mentioned before we started talking today that my hometown is Chicago, and I worked as the Assistant Inspector General for the city of Chicago before coming to the Department of Justice. And I can say, based on my experience, I think my hometown, though I love it, is likely overperforming that 20% number. There's another way to think about it. There's this great quote from a recent 11th Circuit case where the judge opened the opinion by saying, and this is a quote, "Like bears to honey, white-collar criminals are drawn to billion-dollar government programs." And that's true. And I'll tell you the last way I think about it, and I've mentioned this because it's very recent, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, just put out a report where they were trying to estimate. They were trying to answer this question, Tom, what is the cost of fraud across the government? And they came up with a numerical figure that's quite broad, 233 billion to 521 billion every year. And what really stuck with me was the way they contextualized it. They said that if fraud were a government agency, it would be the sixth largest government agency in the United States if there were a U.S. Department of Fraud.
All right. Well, we could probably discuss that philosophically for hours. Let's get to the operation of the task force. You've added new members. Who are they, and what does it mean when a new member is added? What's incumbent upon them?
Maybe I take a step back, Tom, and explain sort of our structure. Our strike force includes federal prosecutors, so that's folks from the Antitrust Division, and we're now up to 25 U.S. attorneys' offices. So those are the federal prosecutors who sit in cities and districts around the country. We have 12 national law enforcement partners. So it's 11 offices of Inspector General at the federal level and the FBI. And so we work together on that two-pronged mission set. I'm really happy that we recently welcomed another Office of Inspector General, the U.S. Department of Commerce, that is now one of our national partners, as well as 3 new U.S. attorneys' offices to our collective effort. And that's the District of New Jersey, the District of Alaska, and the Eastern District of Louisiana, which is headquartered in New Orleans. And they will be joining our existing collective effort and also doing environmental scans and being on the lookout and thinking strategically about what's happening in the commerce world and also in those geographies. And on commerce, the U.S. Department of Commerce is embarking on some pretty significant spending. Its second largest spending program in the history of the department is the bipartisan infrastructure law. Its number one spent program of all time since its existence is the CHIPS Act. And those are 2 very recent spending bills.
And by the way, do you also look at state and local level corruption when that happens? Because sometimes the states and the cities don't have the resources the federal government has.
Absolutely. Some of the core antitrust offenses, bid rigging, price fixing, market allocation, criminal monopolization, those are federal offenses wherever they occur at any point in the market, private and public, and within the public, which is really where I focus my efforts and my thinking, local, state, and federal. And we do rely on and work with our partners at that local and state level to uncover, investigate, and prosecute crimes that are going after their funding. Relatedly, so much of the funding that comes in to the local and state governments is in whole or in part coming from the federal government. So the federal government has a very vested interest in making sure that the programs have integrity.
Sure. And just any recent cases that come to mind that kind of stand out for you?
Yeah, Tom, very recently in the month of May, we had a guilty plea in our Idaho fire investigation. There, we indicted 2 executives with fraud and rigging bids that were submitted to the U.S. Forest Service for contracts to provide critical supplies used to fight forest fires. And this was after an investigation that involved court-authorized wiretaps. And earlier this month, one of those executives pleaded guilty. Now, what happened here, Tom, is for at least 8 years, 2 executives who were supposed to be competing were not. They conspired to rig bids, they conspired to allocate territories, and this was all for a crucial service that helps the U.S. government fight fires in the Rocky Mountain region. And over time, the conspiracy evolved, and they